Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we jump in, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping notes to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message and I'll do my best to help you out. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as a PDF of the presentation itself is going to be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the session, but we encourage you to send your questions throughout the presentation in the chat box, and then we'll just sort of go through them one by one. And then finally, we ask that you hold each other with mutual respect, come to this space teachable, and please stay engaged with our presenter throughout the program. So now I just want to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York program, just in case you haven't heard of us. DHPSNY, as we like to call it, is a collaboration between the New York State Archive and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions such as archives, libraries, museums, historical societies, and all other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as today's webinar. So to learn more about any of our services, you can please visit dhpsny.org. And with all of that, I'm going to pass things over to Dyani, our speaker for the day, to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Leah. I am going to turn off my video for most of the presentation. I'll pop back on for the Q&A. So, all right. So let's go ahead and get started. As Leah mentioned, my name is Dyani Feige. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Director of Preservation Services at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I'll tell you a little bit more about the overall organization of which DHPSNY is a part in just a moment. But just as an expectation setting note to start things off, this topic, though I am very, very interested in it and passionate about it, is not my primary area of focus or expertise. One of the things that we at the Conservation Center pride ourselves on doing is being a connector, being a repository of various resources and disseminating those to our audience. So if you yourself are particularly well-versed in this topic, you may not learn anything new or groundbreaking today. Throughout the presentation, I will definitely be recommending a lot of scholars and initiatives that are creating new innovative thoughts and content on the topic, and I hope there will be some helpful takeaways there. So the Conservation Center, as Leah mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization. We're based in Philadelphia, but we do work all over the country and a bit internationally as well. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, art on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff, of which DHPSNY is a part, work in the field, providing education programs and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. CCAHA also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing and framing, and more. And you can learn a bit more about us if you're interested at our website, which is ccaha.org. As just a very brief background of who I am and what brings me to this topic, I am, of course, presently working in and have been for quite a while in a preservation role, not within a collecting organization. But I do have a background in archives, and I pursued my preservation learning through library school, not a conservation or museum studies program. When asked about what got me into the field of preservation, I like to make sure that folks understand the social justice element of the practice. We would not have collections without preservation. We would not have history without preservation. So my kind of social justice-y approach is to really recognize that by making decisions about what to preserve, we are literally determining the information and knowledge that those who come after us will be able to learn from. Tradition shapes our understanding of the world. In working with organizations throughout the country and internationally representing countless topics and populations, I've developed a passionate appreciation for documenting and giving voice to the vastly different experiences chronicled in these collections. As an employee responsible for the preservation of our nation's and world's stories, I understand, or at least like to recognize, my critical role in the protection and interpretation of these voices. I wholeheartedly believe that diversity and inclusion have a vital role in preservation. Again, the stewardship of collections ultimately affects the actual stories of the collection's items as they progress through time. And to speak specifically to the transmission of information, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about preserving archives, as librarian Stacy Williams wrote, neutrality doesn't encourage our critical thinking. It doesn't ask us to question facts that are wrong or behaviors that are prejudiced. By this measure, neutrality doesn't necessarily reveal injustice, but further entrenches it, which is ironic. But just to level set and to be completely transparent about the privilege that I bring to my role, I am, as you will see in the next few slides that have some demographics about the archival field and the conservation field, I am very indicative of the majority of the field. So you can see up here on the slide, these, the two towards the left, these are my kind of areas of privilege, and I am not alone in the field. That is, there are barriers to entry. It is a privileged field. I'll talk more later about some less quote unquote traditional institutional collecting initiatives, but the standard bread and butter archivist position at many institutions is going to come with the same requirements for advanced degrees, often years of unpaid internships, the privilege of even being in a situation where you can take this time out to focus on schooling in and of itself is a dividing wall. The Society of American Archivists and other regional archival associations are doing work to try to provide scholarships and career pathways for folks who don't necessarily fit that model of privilege, but these can only go so far. I don't call these out to point fingers specifically at what a terrible job they're doing, and I don't think they are, because I really do believe that overall the intentions are there. Just to be really clear that words are only as good as the paper or screen they're written on unless they're backed up with actions. So there is still a lot of work to do, though the Society of American Archivists and other similar associations are trying to put this dedication behind adjusting those demographics. There's a bit less recent and less comprehensive data available for the conservation field, but here are some figures specifically on race from 2018. This is pretty dramatic, but not entirely shocking. And here as well, the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation does have this written, and again, I believe they're putting work behind it, commitment to diversity, but definitely still work to be done. But bringing it back to archives for the majority of this discussion, let's dive into the concept of archival neutrality or lack thereof. As early as 1970, Howard Zinn gave a talk to the Society of American Archivists in which he asserted the archivist, in subtle ways, tends to perpetuate the political and economic status quo simply by going about his ordinary business. His supposed neutrality is, in other words, a fake. So this was 1970. The concept of lack of archival neutrality is not a new concept. But still, for many, many years, including while I was in library school in the very early 2000s, we were taught that archivists' roles were to be completely objective, to simply transmit factual information. Use the words of the creators in your descriptions of the materials, we were told. And if it's something like the objects this business produced could be either known as widgets or doodads, and this business always referred to them as widgets, 100% use that word. Cross-reference it if doodads is maybe more widely familiar, but that's that. But there are definitely other cases that are not this cut and dry, particularly when it comes to words that were used in the past that are considered harmful now. Ways of describing oneself or one's family that foregrounds particular facets of the story while completely leaving out, for example, the fact that they enslaved dozens of individuals and relied on their labor to get to the point of wealth or renown where researchers might be interested in reading about the family today. This intention puts all the work on the researchers to, in some cases, possibly have to read between the lines and make those moral judgments. This is a snapshot from my own copy of Developing and Maintaining Practical Archives, the second edition, which was published in 2003. And these were my grad school highlights on there. So it is being taught. To be fair, calling out that particular portion might not be entirely judicious to the base sentiment. It's important to recognize that in everything we're going to be talking about today, I'm not suggesting that by recognizing we can't fall back on the illusion of neutrality, we should all let loose and start inserting personal opinions, tastes, etc. into the work we do. We can still strive for objectivity. The lesson to just present factual assertions without embellishment still stands, but we just need to dive a little further and unpack the factual assertions. Try to present a wider range of them to give the researcher as close to the entirety of the picture as we can. We're still putting the work on them in a certain sense, but just with more to go on. A certain level of objectivity is a professional responsibility. Pretending that we can be fully neutral is ignoring the entirety of the context that we are working within. To put it slightly in a different way and to hint at the what can we actually do about this portion of the talk that I'll get to in a bit, the challenge is when attempting to be as objective as we possibly can in the pursuit of ultimate neutrality, we avoid controversy, reinforce assumptions and stereotypes, and miss a potential opportunity to do some good. As Thomas L. Haskell wrote, and this was specifically about historians, but I think the concept is very smoothly transferred to archivists as well. Historians and others can be objective without forsaking engagement in discussions of values, politics, or social policy. But again, more on that a bit later. So just to set the stage, here are some of the baseline assumptions that we're working with. As Sam Wynn stated in 2017 in a session at a MERAC program, the historic record has been repeatedly muddled and punctuated by perfectly, quote unquote, their quotes, honest scholars who thought they were telling the truth. Archivists are not exempt from this defect. In fact, our hubristic trust in our own capacity for objectivity makes us rather dangerous custodians. So, archives are created and designed by humans. We all bring our own experiences, contexts, and biases to the work that we do. And even the systems and standards put in place to try to reduce choice and subjectivity were created by humans, typically white humans with relative privilege. So just as another quote from Sam Wynne, true neutrality is an impossible aspiration because we as archivists are individual practitioners called upon to distill the historic record through the inescapable lens of our personal worldviews. So it matters to my work that I am a white woman with an advanced degree, and both my parents went to college, and I grew up in the United States. These things matter. We bring our experiences to the work that we do. So just another quote, I warned you, I'm going to be reading a lot of them. Archivists have changed from being passive keepers of an entire documentary residue left by creators to becoming active shapers of the archival heritage. And this is not to suggest that the archivists have changed. It's always been this way. It's just our recognition of that, the understanding and context of their role in the preservation of history. What would it look like for archives to be neutral, even if that's not entirely possible? These points were kind of off the top of my head, and it's possible you could think of more. If you can, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But decisions are made based on a disinterested, possibly data-driven formula. Authenticity matters, but not truth. Value is consistent and measurable. Access is entirely equal to all. Descriptions are clinical and standardized. And representation, this last one is maybe the least likely to come to pass, but representation in an archive is equal to representation in the community. The human element is important, of course, but we also have to remember that there are systems in place guiding us as humans, whether we're consciously aware of it on a daily basis or not. These include systems at a very high level, like the society and cultural context in which we operate. In the United States, many would acknowledge this as a white supremacy culture. The institutions within where we work then, the actual organizations themselves, they also have certain structures in place that are supposed to drive our decisions. To a certain extent, that is important. We need some framework to work effectively. But of course, many of these institutions have their own roots, or worse, within the power imbalances of society. So starting at the institutional level and then sort of drilling down, though it's not an entirely hierarchical path, the very infrastructures that have this responsibility of collecting are themselves exclusionary. When public libraries were initially founded in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, they were ostensibly for the edification of the masses, which, while great in concept, pretty much excluded those who couldn't read. This, of course, was disproportionately going to include enslaved individuals, women, those living in rural areas, etc. So let's start with the first gateway through which all archives, again, specifically in the context we're talking about of quote unquote traditional collecting organizations, deciding what is actually worthy of being collected. Here are a few excellent quotes on the topic, coming at it from slightly different angles. I'll just pause a moment for you to, I don't have to read these to you if you want to read the quotes on the screen. As you might be able to glean, the board quote is more aimed at libraries, but I think the sentiment is relevant here too. Let's be clear. It is a privilege to walk into a repository and recognize that a significant portion of the materials collected and preserved there represent some facet of identity that you share. When we experience the opposite, when we don't see ourselves reflected in the record, we do not share that privilege. By deciding to collect and preserve one thing as part of an archive, basic economics tells us that there is a counter decision that something else is being left out. Not on a conscious level, it's just the way it works. Since again, it is humans making these selections and our understanding of value and significance has evolved and continues to over time, this inevitably means that the vast majority of what could conceivably be considered documentary evidence has actually not been collected. Human nature is to center ourselves in the story. It's not a bad thing to want to keep your own family photo album and not that of a complete random stranger. We just have to recognize that we're bringing this nature to the table. This happens in an institutional context as well, even if the parameters around it seem more formal and structured. If most of the individuals taking photographs in the US in the 1950s were middle or upper class white men, there will be an overrepresentation of middle or upper class white people in a US mid-century street photography collection. A lot of institutions have been making overt statements about these silences and biases, which I think is a good thing and is also, the first step is recognizing it. The second step is setting an intention to remove some of these silences and biases. The definitions on this screen are from a library guide from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which actually, if you click into this link, and again, all of the slides and with links will be sent out shortly. This library guide actually takes it one step further and actually recommends some different institutions doing reparative collecting work, which I thought that was pretty cool. And again, I know I've said this already, I will probably say it again, but I think it's really important to point out that just because it's not intentional doesn't mean it's not happening or not harmful. The concept of neglectful complacency. The people with the most power and influence are the people who set up our institutions historically. So naturally, the people with power and influence consider the evidence of their lives to be important and worth saving. I'm sure it will come as no surprise then to conclude that far more of the traditional archive record comprises white men than equals their representation in the field. And I got some of the specific language on this slide from a library guide on researching primary materials in the Ohio University Archives and Special Collections. So I'm linking to that statement here as well. There is also the concept, and I don't really get into this as deeply in this presentation, but I think it's important to recognize that archives tend to collect things thought of at the time as being of great significance. So commemorating events, important transactions, etc. Whereas what we now call ephemera, the information about everyday boring life, is often not intentionally contemporaneously collected. And this is just an entire book on the concept of silencing silences, gaps, and biases in the record if you are interested in diving a little deeper. And with that, we're going to change gears just a little bit. So we talked about the door through which collections must pass, essentially the appraisal process. And now we're getting a little more into the nitty gritty of working with archival collections, the processing, the arrangement, and description. So many of you are probably familiar, along with original order, one of the most fundamental principles of archival processing and management is that of provenance, the focus on the creator or the collector. This is, of course, the principle that, in simple terms, records from one creator shouldn't be mixed with another. This is part of what helps us determine what is considered a separate collection. But if we look into that obsessive focus on there being one very clear creator, we can probably see how quickly this might start to break down. I'll use an example of missionary records that documented individuals living in quote unquote non-Western areas of the world. And this is a real example. While certainly there is a wealth of informational value in the fact that these missionaries recorded demographics about the individuals living there, who may otherwise very likely not have been documented in the written record, or at least the Western written record. Who owns that information? I'll tell you, in the case that I'm referring to, this information was supposedly created by the missionaries themselves. The same goes, of course, for enslaved populations in the US. Residents or prisoners at institutions like highly problematic mental hospitals of the past. The list could go on and on. It makes sense, and you can continue the ball of string as a concept, but hopefully you can also see how much of a power imbalance that concept can reinforce. When provenance emerged as a critically important concept in archives, the vast majority of those individuals who had any control or ownership over their own humanity, whether structurally or actually legally, were, again, white men. This very traditional concept of ownership or even creation is a lot less clear when it comes to digital records. So on a practical level, rethinking provenance has to happen kind of most immediately and critically within the field of digital preservation, where stewardship can be shared and complex. Community archives, particularly those with a digital focus, are really in some ways taking the lead on looking at this. So the quote from Jarrett Drake, users should see names not from an authorized source or agency, but names asserted by people, organizations, and communities responsible for the shared creation, stewardship, and custody of records. So we've talked a bit about unintentional biases and exclusions from the record, but it's really important to acknowledge as well that sometimes these exclusions or manipulations are all too intentional. Unfortunately, that often happens when governmental, institutional, or corporate corruption is involved. We could spend all day discussing case studies and upsetting cover-ups along these lines, but instead I'll try to put things in at least relatively positive perspective and just share that, at least in the US, there have been some significant acts passed in response to some of the major incidents. Of course, we will probably never entirely get away from this, but the more we confront it, the more we can strive for an open, authentic, historic record. So we have talked about the obvious and practical exclusion of things not being collected and preserved in the first place. But even beyond that point, the way that things are described can really impact the way the information is accessible. There is a level of archival silence that's not just about what's there, but how it is described or not. Many of these points up here are probably fairly familiar, but and when we think about the importance of language, often the first thing that comes to mind is terms that are considered offensive or harmful now. But even less obvious framings insert value. It is the world experiencing a war in Ukraine, or is it a quote unquote special military operation? Obscured identities is a really big one too. I actually can remember the first time I got an envelope that was addressed to Mrs. Jacob Feige. And I mean, I'm being a little flippant here, but I didn't even know. It took me a minute to process that was for me. That's not my name. This is one area where a lot of organizations have been trying to move in the more complete, accurate direction of going through records, finding aids, and changing, Mrs. Husband's name to the person's actual name. And the reason this matters is because we're both concerned with correcting historical biases and exclusions, as well as making sure contemporary users will find the things they are looking for. My 13-year-old daughter would probably have no idea what I was talking about if I said something to her about her mobile phone. I have an image of the robin up here on the slide because of the picture a bird exercise, where some significant number of folks will have a robin immediately spring to mind when asked that question. The platonic ideal of a generic bird, I guess. The problem is, if I ask folks to picture a doctor, some significant number of folks on the street would likely picture a white, middle-aged male doctor. And this is reflected in archival description. Race, ethnicity, and gender tend to be called out more frequently when they are not considered the default. And as the thought that I shared earlier about not seeing oneself in the record suggests here too, this is immediately alienating and unwelcoming to a huge swath of the population. And this is just, you can click through the links here to note an interesting case study on this topic. The author posted on listservs and in discussion groups about language around removing the diacritics in order to process the files. And the discussion generated, or the query generated discussion that seemed to suggest, again, maybe implicitly, but that Spanish, the assumption that Spanish was inferior to English. It's okay to remove the diacritics in these names and words because it doesn't matter as much, the idea. Removing the diacritics could completely change the word. So keeping the linguistic integrity of these file and folder names shouldn't be a compromise on an ideal. It is the very practical responsibility of processing archivists and other digital curation laborers to preserve as much of the original content and context of the collections we've been entrusted to preserve and provide access to. I just went through this exact challenge when downloading and working with a number of files shared by colleagues at an institution in Puerto Rico with whom we are partnering. Because English and English spelling is the default on my computer, it would not even let me actually save these files in the way that I wanted to. Well, I worked around it, but that's too long of a story. It created a challenge. So, how do we actually address this issue, the issue of language? We have to remember that this is going to take a long time. We're not going to solve it in a day. It's important, though, to set goals and plans moving forward if you are interested in what is kind of commonly known as reparative description. So the aim to remediate or contextualize potentially outdated or harmful language that will create archival description that is more accurate, inclusive, and community-centered. The best we can do really when it comes to description sometimes is considering and incorporating both content and context in order to best understand what we are actually collecting and preserving. So providing context within finding aids is really important. Finding aids and other descriptive tools. If there are questions, reinforce the idea that this document was created at a given point in time, the collection was processed at a given point in time, etc. Just because something is written one way one year doesn't mean that we can't change the future if relevant. So think of this as an iterative process. Again, we're not going to solve it in a day. If we aim to repair past harm, we can go back and do this. Working directly with community members to understand how they want to be described. You know, what word do you use when you talk about your cultural community? Again, if the records are not in English, hire or engage practitioners who actually speak that language to process or even just consult on the project. Just relying on Google Translate is definitely not going to get you there. And again, I sort of speak from experience. And again, providing that context, keeping notes of dates and changes so that users can ultimately examine the history of the finding aid itself as an artifact. Many institutions are starting to put up harmful language statements on their finding aid pages, the about the special collections and archives pages, etc. So you can consider it somewhat of a content warning, a contextualization, but again, acknowledging that even though we can go back and change things that we've created in the past, the work is never really done. So acknowledging the work that is happening and recognizing that is, I think, very important for researchers to understand what a process it is. So again, just a couple links to some harmful language statements. This program is mostly about archives again, but because I am working in a preservation role, I want to be clear that this issue is not just about archivists. The American Institute for Conservation worked on a very expansive, intensive research study and publication about some of the findings and goals, which was called Held in Trust. You can download the entire lengthy document here, but also it's broken out into sections: diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility being one section among others. So just from the specifically collections care side, recognizing some of the work that remains to be done and offering up some suggestions on how we might at least start doing that work. So again, I just have a few more slides and then we will have plenty of time for questions, but I want to acknowledge, reiterate, and awareness is the first step. Recognizing, being aware that these issues are issues. You're never going to get beyond the issues if you don't recognize it and hold awareness. Making a stated commitment is a next step. And it is something, but we're never going to actually move forward unless we are actually practicing what we preach, whatever metaphor you want to use, putting our money where our mouth is and pursuing that commitment in action. No element of archival work is unbiased or neutral. Archivists still strive to exercise their ethical professional judgment in the appraisal, acquisition, and processing of materials. Decisions should always be made mindfully, aiming to ensure the preservation, authenticity, diversity, and lasting cultural and historical value of materials. This is from the SAA Code of Ethics, of course. So this is the awareness and the statement of commitment stage. But what can we actually do? What are the steps forward? It's important to acknowledge again that any of these actions we put in place to try to address the situation at hand are not going to solve things. This is all in the pursuit of a more complete, diverse, and authentic record. We're probably never going to get to the most, all of the issues are solved and better place, but striving for more. What are some actions that we can take? Again, the awareness and the stated commitment that comes out of the awareness. Re-examine our own professional assumptions, methods, and practices in light of the desired outcomes of justice and diversity. So if you yourself are bringing some levels of privilege to the table, it's important to acknowledge that and be aware of it. Cultural competency into the programs that many quote unquote traditional archivists are coming directly out of. Academic training programs, and if not in the colleges and universities formal training programs themselves, then seeking out other professional development opportunities in the field. And then holding institutions and professional associations accountable for not just taking those first two steps, the awareness and the stated commitment, but taking the steps to actually implement progress. Jarrett Drake, I've quoted them a few times, but another quote from him is, bringing stakeholders of all variety, like community members as selectors, will be really important, and connecting that process to the larger process for liberation. The more work I do, still quote from him, the more work I do, the more apparent it is that there's no way to talk about liberational value if you don't address the needs communities are facing. Archives have never been neutral. They are the creation of human beings who have politics in their nature. Centering the goals of liberation is at the heart of the issue. So direct involvement from community members. This is a really, really great way of moving forward. With that caveat in mind, I think it's also very important to recognize that sometimes some collections are best served being cared for by the community that they document. You can't assume that everything belongs in an institution. And this is where I can give a timely plug for the DHPSNY's series of spring and summer in-person programs about how institutions can work with community archives and members of community to help inform everyone all around. We're not saying XYZ University takes all of this neighborhood's stuff. We're suggesting that XYZ University give this neighborhood the tools, information, and empowerment to care for their own stuff. It's really going to be very much a case-by-case basis. Provide access to a wider user base, in part by being receptive to a wider range of needs. Even examining access policies, researcher policies, can be a helpful step in determining just how wide a community your institution is potentially reaching. Are there barriers there that don't really need to be there? Are there barriers that maybe center the collection's preservation needs while not considering the needs of potential researchers? Particularly as a preservation professional, my sort of job is to always be the voice of the collections, but this isn't the way that we're going to necessarily reach the widest audience. So just, again, recognizing and interrogating these issues. Actively seeking out collections and items that are currently underrepresented in your collections, if that is an appropriate measure. And I didn't actually link it on here. Apologies. I'm going to make a note to myself to link to it in the follow-up information. But Carnegie Mellon University hosted an online exhibit in 2020 that was called What We Don't Have. It was text only, very intentional, and went through, it explored topics that I think all of them, I might be wrong on that, I think all of them were directly related to the university, but not comprehensively represented in their collections. The great thing about this was that it was accompanied by a commitment to more active collecting in certain topic areas. And then finally, be willing to take a stand. If your institution is uncomfortable with that, there are ways to take a stand individually. Of course, protect yourself and your safety. These are strange times in the world, in the nation, in academia, in collecting organizations. But if there is a way that you can take a stand, I would encourage you all to do that. My final 2 slides are just a lot of links to some other resources. There are, again, the practice of reparative description. This list is just scratching the surface, but I wanted to provide you with some links to resources on this topic. And most of these links are here because they include not only good content themselves, but a lot of additional links out to other resources as well. I might specifically point out this research available through the Archival Decolonist blog, the second one up here on the screen, which is looking at the fact that the vast majority of descriptions of indigenous cultures and communities are actually created by non-indigenous people using terms and concepts that the communities themselves might not even share. And so what are ways that we can move forward on this? This gets into the concept, I've touched on it kind of adjacently a few times, the concept of colonialism in archives. And a coworker of mine recommended works by the anthropologist Benedict Anderson, who looks at challenges in describing divisions and subgroups that are colonially imposed. We could zoom way out on this and spend a long time thinking about how, even lines on a map aren't real. And I'm not here to go down quite that level of philosophical rabbit holes, but just keeping in mind, broken record, awareness and recognizing our role in this always has to be the first step. And then my final slide of links and info is highlighting some community-centered collecting initiatives. Again, just scratching the surface with these links. If you know of other really great community collecting initiatives, community archives, I'm definitely very interested to learn more. There are some pretty well-known projects on this list, at least in this field, and some smaller ones as well. A quick Google may well call up lists or examples within your region of the world or area of collecting interest, but I would definitely encourage you to check out some of these and learn about what they are doing in, again, the quote unquote, non-traditional, non-institutional setting. Whoops. Sorry about that. I don't know, lost my presentation for a sec. I think I accidentally clicked stop share. Sorry, don't get seasick. Okay, back to my contact information. I have, let's see, about 8 or so minutes for questions now. I would definitely encourage anyone to reach out to me via email as well if you have questions that either we don't get to now or you'd rather ask just one-on-one. I see there are a few chats. First off, there's a one pretty quick query that I can cover in less than a minute. Yes, no worries about copying and pasting the lists now. We are sending out the slides and the Zoom recording will be available, but we'll send out a PDF of the slides, and I'll make sure that you can click through all of the links within the PDF. So yes, definitely not intended to be something you're all frantically copying down at that point in time. And then another kind of deeper question, how do you avoid your own personal bias when collecting archives? This is a personal ask of me. What mind frame do you enter your projects? Well, I think, first off, there's no avoiding personal bias. We bring what we bring to the table in terms of our personal experience and background. So I think recognizing that, but also how to kind of move, not necessarily move past that, but move deeper within a more kind of holistic, conscientious effort. I would say one of my first steps, if I am working with collections that do not share my identity experience, I would try to learn as much as possible, if possible, from community members themselves. I mean, reading publications, materials, blogs, about this community, ideally, that have been written by community members themselves. Now, I think it's important to point out also that we don't want to burden people with always having to answer our questions. So I think there is a fine line that comes with reaching out to community members of whose identities we don't necessarily share. So I think the first step would be to try to learn about what else might be out there. And then just try to be kind of as open to learning, and I mean myself learning, and being incorrect. I think it's important to acknowledge. I mean, I'll say for myself, I think I have acknowledged and then hopefully surpassed a lot of assumptions about people who aren't like me. And that's human nature. It's where no one is born being able to immediately skip past the assumption phase. So I think acknowledging that we can be wrong is really important as well. Looking into, like, I mean, particularly when talking about language and description, looking into tools from the resources that are up on the screen, some of which anyway have been created by members of communities that I do not share. And yes, the first step is always going to be learning. If appropriate, if relevant, asking might be the next step, but that's not always possible. And when I think it was up, I think it was in my slide, but just in case, I don't think I stated it out loud. Maybe I didn't state it. Maybe wasn't in my slide either. Compensation is really important. If we do get to this phase of asking community members to help us learn about their communities and experiences, if at all possible, compensate them for their time. I know we're all resource stretched, and that might be a hurdle, but it is a really, really important way to acknowledge the effort that this takes. And I didn't even mention the Q&A, or I didn't even click over to the Q&As. Oh, this is a really good one, I think. How do you balance a desire to use appropriate / non-offensive language with the need for enabling access to materials, for example, via keyword searching for researchers? That is where content and context really comes into play. I mean, certainly with some words or phrases that are truly that we recognize now, it can be harmful and offensive to even read those words or phrases in print. But I will say, if there are certain words or phrases that maybe they were contained within the collection themselves, you can include those words in the finding aid if that is what someone may likely be searching for, but with the context and explanation that now we use a different word or phrase. So, you know, there are lines that there are boundaries where you don't even want to use certain words or phrases. In that case, hopefully people wouldn't be searching for those within the archival context, but for other things that are a little bit, less cut and dry, you can refer to those. And that's, I mean, I used the very simple example towards the beginning of widgets versus doodads. If the company said widgets, but the more commonly used word is doodads, you use both and you just kind of cross-reference. And I think I have time for one other question. There are a couple other ones in the Q&A that we could probably spend a long time on. But one question that is at least fairly straightforward, what is the best way to address language shifts over time on public-facing portions of your collection? Again, I think including that, the cross-referencing, the information about we used to use this word, but now we use this one. I think that can help help researchers very well. And that's an issue too, where, you know, public facing information, websites, finding aids, online exhibits, etc. You can't change it all at once. You know, there will be some places inevitably that fall out of date as language changes. So just having that effort and intention to try to move things forward. It's really all we can really do. Not that saying all that we can really do means it's an easy process, but I think we are at time. There were a couple questions that I didn't get to, but I would love to, if you're comfortable, I would love to try to address those over email. So for folks whose questions I did not get to, please email me. I think one of the simplest but biggest takeaways here is that it's not the archivist's role to be passive. We are human with our own backgrounds and experiences. And even if we were mechanized robots, at least now in 2025, those robots will have been programmed by humans. Instead, essentially every step of the archival process, from considering what to collect, to arranging and describing, to allocating resources around management and preservation, is an active endeavor in which we have a great responsibility to shape the world's collective histories. By hiding behind this elusive concept of neutrality, practitioners are actually not only making ourselves socially irrelevant, but reinforcing the oppression. So thank you so much for joining me. You will receive copies of the slides, hopefully with the links live. I got other questions that are really good questions. I just didn't have time for them. So again, if you're willing, please send them my way. My email is up here on the screen. And thank you all so much.